Renewed tensions in Ukraine after pro-Russian separatist moves in the east. Critics say Moscow is getting ready to invade Ukraine, but Russia says it's the West that's stirring up all the trouble. So is Russia really intent on tearing Ukraine apart? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Hazem Sika. Well, the crisis over Ukraine's future is now in danger of escalating, first from Crimea and now to eastern Ukraine. Pro-Russian demonstrators in the city of Donetsk declared the region around it a people's republic and demanded a referendum on secession from Ukraine. While in Ukraine's second largest city of Kharkiv, security forces retook control of the administration building early on Tuesday from a group of pro-Russian separatists. Kim Vanel has more from Donetsk.
Adding fuel to the fire, pro-Russia protesters clashed with Ukrainian government forces in the eastern city of Kharkiv. Activists calling for autonomy from Kiev had been in control of the government administration building since Sunday. But by Tuesday morning, special forces had taken control, arresting 70 people. Ukraine's acting president says those caught will face the full force of the law.
Last night, the Donetsk building where the security service of Ukraine is located was cleared of criminals. This morning, the regional administration building of Kharkiv region was completely cleared of separatists. During the liberation of the building, guns and hand grenades were used against police. Several policemen were badly injured. During the liberation of the regional administration, 70 criminals were detained.
The raid in Kharkiv is heightening tension in Donetsk, where pro-Russian groups remain in control of one central state building. Protesters have reinforced their barricades, but Ukraine's deputy prime minister says police won't storm the building right away and hopes a deal can be reached. But inside the besieged pro-Russian headquarters, confusion reigns. The number of armed activists is falling, and different leaders now speak for different factions.
There are private talks and there are private negotiations between influential people, but no one is negotiating with the people of the Republic.
But signs of the activists' continued calls to join Russia still plaster the walls, and they say they're prepared for any eventuality. Despite all the talk of negotiation, Molotov cocktails are at the ready. The people here tell us that if the authorities from Kiev do move in with special police forces, that they are prepared to use them. Tensions too in Parliament, where a fistfight broke out. Communist Party leaders accuse politicians in Kiev of complicity in the unrest in the east.
Wasn't it you who provided a scenario and an example? It turns out you were following not an American plan but a Russian one on how to destroy the independence of Ukraine.
In Donetsk, support outside the government administration building is dwindling, although protesters say they'll continue calls for a referendum over joining Russia. Maintaining Donetsk is an independent republic which should be listened to as they wait for Ukrainian authorities to move. Kim Vanel, Al Jazeera, Donetsk.
Now, NATO has warned Russia of what it calls grave consequences if it intervened further in Ukraine. But Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov dismissed those accusations and says he's prepared to meet Ukrainian and Western leaders to help solve the crisis. More now from Peter Sharp in Moscow.
I think a little more positive news coming out of Moscow on Tuesday. Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, said Russia was prepared to consider sitting down and taking part in negotiations to try and find a diplomatic solution to the crisis in Ukraine. That would involve America, Ukraine, Russia and the EU sitting down all together for the first time to try and find a diplomatic solution to the crisis. This is an idea that was first floated by the Americans when Kerry met with Sergei Lavrov in Paris on the 30th. Since then, it's been under discussion. No time really, firm time has been set, but the Americans like it sooner rather than later, and they're hoping for the talks to be convened in about 10 days' time. The Russians say they are prepared to negotiate, but they want to know what the precise agenda of this conference is going to be. Meanwhile, there's been more very fierce words from the Kremlin in Moscow earlier today, with Moscow warning Kiev that to send any reinforcements down to the south and east of the Ukraine could risk civil war. Peter Sharp for Inside Story in Moscow.
For more on this, I'm joined by our guests from Kiev, Mychailo Wynnychyj, Associate Professor at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, and from London, Lilit Gevorgyan, Russia analyst at IHS Global. Lilit is also a senior economist for CIS Europe. Thanks for being with us. Let's talk first of all about the events in Crimea and the possible scenario that we may have in eastern Ukraine as a result of this. Are we looking here, Lilit Gevorgyan, at a second Crimea scenario in Ukraine's east? And if we are, is Russia trying to orchestrate it?
Well, two questions there, really. I would say that Russia had the opportunity and has the opportunity to indeed stage an incursion into eastern Ukraine if this is the true intention. But I believe that Crimean situation differs from what we're seeing in eastern Ukraine. I do not think that Russia will really cross that red line that was so clearly spelled out by NATO, and it wouldn't really enter into southern and eastern Ukraine unless there are serious clashes and unless there are casualties, and high number of casualties amongst the ethnic Russians. So I think that Russia is also quite aware that crossing that red line would have serious implications, and one of them is the third wave of sanctions, Western sanctions, which would involve economic and energy measures punishing Russia.
The accusation, though, from people in Ukraine and from the West is that Russia is just itching for an excuse to get into eastern Ukraine. Do you think there's any truth to that?
But I think that strategically Crimea was far more important, and also it was an autonomous republic that Russia said had the right to self-determination. It's hard to see how Russia would be able to justify its actions in eastern Ukraine, which are part of the Ukraine proper. At the same time, as I said, I think Russia, if it really had the determination or intention to go into these regions, it would have gone already. And I don't think that it is necessarily itching to get there. I don't think that it also wants to have these regions because they're not as strategically vital as Crimea.
Well, Russia continues to deny that it has anything to do with what's happening in Donetsk, but Ukraine's interim prime minister is not convinced. I'm going to show you what he said now, addressing the cabinet. He said an anti-Ukrainian plan is being put into operation under which foreign troops will cross the border and seize the territory of the country. We will not allow this. If I could turn back to you then, Mychailo Wynnychyj, I mean, this is exactly the scenario that many people inside Ukraine feared in the Kiev government. What if that does? First of all, do you believe that will happen? And if it does, what options are there really for the government in Kiev?
Well, with all due respect to the other guest, I think that it's probably a little bit incorrect to talk about Russia's motives within the paradigm of strategic importance and whether or not it is legitimate or not legitimate in terms of Crimea being an autonomous republic, whereas the eastern Ukrainian provinces or oblasts not being autonomous. Look, the reality is that from Kyiv's perspective, what's going on at the moment is the expansion of Russia proper, meaning sort of a reconstitution of a Russian empire. We're talking about the Russian media, which we receive here. Up until recently, we've been watching very closely. Has been fervently nationalistic, and the message coming out of the Russian media is the same message that Putin actually gave to George W. Bush, or George Bush Jr. at one point, and that is that they see Ukraine as basically being a historical misunderstanding. Eastern Ukraine, in the eyes of sort of the Russian historical myth, is part of Russia, and Putin seems to be trying to sort of gather the ancient Russian lands, or what he sees as the ancient Russian lands. Now, that's the fear that's going on in Kiev at the moment. What's going on in Donetsk, it's clearly not a sort of a groundswell of pro-Russian nationalism. A lot of the people that are demonstrating are clearly either paid demonstrators or are actually Russian citizens.
Why'd you say they're paid demonstrators?
Well, first of all, we have evidence of the fact that they're being paid to come to the demonstrations. I mean, their money is being handed out at the demonstrations by the organizers, first of all. Secondly, what we're talking about is people that are I mean, these are not, I'm sitting in front of in the background here, what you see is Maidan, which is the Independent Square in Kyiv. This was a place where 2 months ago, we had a massive groundswell of idealistic demonstrators. What we're seeing in Donetsk today are not idealistic demonstrators. They're people that are coming out for the day to make a buck, to make some noise, to possibly bump some heads, and then they go home. This is not an idealistic kind of groundswell movement, which is usually what sort of revolutions or separatist movements that are genuine start with.
Lilit Gevorgyan, what about the concerns then of many of the people in eastern Ukraine who have always looked to Russia as their sort of sphere of influence, if you like? They've always identified more with Russia. Are their concerns being addressed by the government in Ukraine, and should the government in Ukraine be doing more?
We have to be a bit objective as to what is motivating Russian speakers at the moment, and it is a bit hard to believe that whoever goes out on the streets and demands closer relations with Russia are literally in the pockets of Russian security services and are being paid. There are legitimate concerns, and one of them is not having really a unity government in Crimea, a government that also represents the eastern and southern Ukrainian regions, something that hopefully will be corrected quite soon after the presidential elections. Secondly, and I think this is far greater danger that Ukraine faces in the coming months, is the economic factor, meaning the Ukrainian government has embarked on a really difficult austerity measures roadmap to rebalance the economy, which will hurt most of the households. Prices will go up, import prices will go up, and many Russian speakers in the eastern regions and southern regions could argue that they haven't really voted or wanted this change. They could look at Crimea, which is due to get billions from Russia, and think, well, we could have had better life if we were with Russia. So this is quite serious concern, and I don't think it's wise to dismiss this social factors.
All right, I want to put that. I want to put that then to Mychailo Wynnychyj, because he's quite virulently shaking his head about that. Aren't these legitimate concerns on the part of Eastern Ukrainians? I mean, they didn't sign up to any of this. They certainly didn't vote for it.
Look, first of all, what we need to realize is for the last 3 years, the government of Ukraine nationally has been run by people that have been from the eastern region, specifically from Donetsk, from one city. Suddenly now we have a government which is much more balanced regionally. We have a minister who is from Crimea. We have an interior minister who is from Kharkiv. We have people, the acting president is from Dnipropetrovsk and the head of the chairman of the parliament. In other words, we have now a government. Yes, it is an interim government. Of course, it's not an elected government. We're looking at a post-revolutionary situation. But the fact is that people are basically represented from a variety of regions in the central government, which is an exact opposite to what existed under the Yanukovych regime, where every single region of the country, and I remind you there are 25 regions, was governed by someone who was either born or grew up in Donetsk. Every single minister was from eastern Ukraine. Western Ukrainians, southern Ukrainians, central Ukrainians were not represented. Suddenly we have a scenario where we have balance, and the myth that's now being generated is that somehow this is now a grievance. Well, wait a second, that's a problematic thing. Now, I do agree that there are social concerns. I do agree that Donetsk, for example, is a depressed region. It's a very problematic region. It's the equivalent of Yorkshire in England or the Pittsburgh area in the United States. This is an area where we have a lot of coal mines, which are not really, effective economically, and there's been a lot of subsidies going into the area for the last, 5, 6, 7 years. It's not an area that is going to be well placed to cope with the austerity measures that the current government is proposing or has had to propose, because the former government basically
this is what it comes
everything.
down to, though, isn't it? For so many people, Mychailo,
but the problem is that
people vote with their pocketbooks. So it doesn't matter surely whether it comes from Russia or it comes from anywhere else.
Look, the reality is that the IMF and the EU and the United States government and the World Bank have promised so much money into Ukraine at this point that to compare that with the tiddlywinks that is being offered to Crimea by Russia, quite frankly, is just wrong. The arithmetic isn't there. So, the social aspect is important, but anybody that's thinking, that thinks about it realizes that, wait a second, the money that's coming in from the West is about 2 or 3 times more than anything that Russia's offering.
I know you want to respond to some of that, Lilit.
Well, I just have to highlight that money, the money that you're getting from IMF and EU and World Bank, it's definitely a much larger financial aid package than what Russia was offering. But at the same time, they come with quite painful strings attached, and that's my point. Regardless the Russians' design. Regardless Russian design towards eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, you're going to have a social situation where many people will be affected because of this painful strings attached to the international bailout. To rebalance the economy, you have to go through these painful measures. Now, to blame people if they're protesting and say that you're paid by Russian government is not going to help, unless there is a realization that there are also social and economically justified concerns that should be dealt by the central government, whether the current one or the newly formed one. My point is that you have a source of instability in the future, and that is not really coming from Russia, but coming from the difficult austerity measures.
Can I ask? I'd like to ask my colleague a question, if I may. Why is it that the Eastern Ukrainians would be protesting against austerity measures, and the rest of Ukraine, which is being hurt as much, if not more, would not be protesting? The logical link between language and protesting against austerity and this idea of ethnicity and this protesting against the World Bank it's not clear. It's quite the opposite, as a matter of fact. Eastern Ukraine is going to have money poured at it at the moment, and the protest movement has very little economic basis behind it. What they're protesting is they're protesting with Russian flags. They're protesting with supposedly for Russian language, etc. And the fact is, I'm not blaming them for coming out for protesting, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't be coming out protesting if their demands are legitimate. But the reality is that we have footage of people, and this is footage that's all over the news in Ukraine, of people being paid to come out to protest. So the genuineness of these protests, I put under question.
Lilit, you want to respond to that briefly, and then we'll move on.
Yes, absolutely. I think, first of all, just to dispute that point that you've made that IMF money is going to be poured into eastern regions, I highly doubt it. I don't think that anything of to that extent has been discussed or agreed on with the International Monetary Fund. Secondly, I definitely agree that austerity measures will affect everyone across Ukraine. The problem is with the austerity measures is that normally they're carried out by popular governments, when there is popular support, because as I said, this will have an impact on disposable income of households. Now, when you look at Ukraine, which is already divided, already the eastern regions do not have much trust in the central government, and I think you will largely agree with me on this. It's very hard to see why would they be so embracing the difficult economic reforms that will have direct impact on their income. This is why I think that add to already existing discontent, concerns about their cultural identity, linguistic identity, add to this mix an economic hardship that comes from austerity measures, then you have quite difficult situation for the central government.
I just want to direct both of you then to the latest comments from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, which I'm sure you're aware of, writing in the British Guardian newspaper. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says it is the West, not Russia, that is guilty of destabilizing Ukraine. He says they have been trying to compel Ukraine to make a painful choice between East and West, further aggravating internal differences. He goes on to say Ukraine should bring about constitutional reform to ensure the rights of minorities, commenting, "We are not imposing anything on anyone. We just see that if it is not done, Ukraine will continue to spiral into crisis with unpredictable consequences. We stand ready to join international efforts aimed at achieving these goals." So, Mychailo, your reaction to this then?
Well, this is precisely my point. Look, I agree with everything that my colleague has said with respect to austerity measures hurting the population, and with respect to the fact that the current government is not particularly popular in the East. There's no doubt about that. The issue is not whether there's a popularity and whether there's austerity measures that should be brought about, and whether there's an economic mess in Ukraine. There is an economic and political mess in Ukraine. The issue is, will Ukrainians be given a chance to sort things out themselves? What Mr. Lavrov is suggesting is that Russia dictate the constitutional setup of Ukraine. Russia and the EU and the United States should get together and somehow tell Ukraine how to fix its problems. I think Ukrainians have, and it doesn't matter if we're Easterners, Westerners, Centralers, or Southerners, I think any citizens of any country would have a problem with the fact that the internal conditions of how the economy and how the political sphere is going to be structured in this country are going to be told or dictated by a deal that is going to be made somewhere outside of this country by people that were never elected and were never even brought in as Ukrainian politicians. It sounds like another Yalta deal. It sounds like another Munich. It sounds like something that where, you know, out of the mid-20th century, where the great powers would get together and decide the fate of small countries. That's wrong in the 21st century.
All right, let's talk a bit more, just in the couple of minutes we got left, about a man who's been at the center of all of this, regardless of how you may feel about him, Russian President Vladimir Putin. We're talking here, Lilit Gevorgyan, about a leader who called the collapse of the Soviet Union, of which Ukraine was a part of, the single greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. He was also quoted in a conversation with US President George W. Bush, in which he told him that Ukraine is not even a state. It is part of it is Eastern Europe, but part of it was gifted by us. That's what he said. Given all of that, why shouldn't we be suspicious of Russia's motives in Ukraine?
Oh, I absolutely agree. And just to comment on Lavrov's statement, I'd say that, you know, in getting involved in blame game is not helping Ukraine at all. And indeed, there has been a tendency, at least in the past decade, by Russia to sort of recreate this 19th century style exclusive club of power brokers in the world who sort of make global decisions. And obviously for the Ukrainians this is not an acceptable way of dealing with what they see as their internal issues. The problem at the moment with the Ukrainian crisis is that, unfortunately, for the Ukrainian government and for Ukrainian people, it has become a geopolitical issue, and by nature of it, we're seeing Russia and US and EU on the other side, who are trying to pull their weight, and this is turned into some sort of a geopolitical race as well. from that perspective, indeed, I think the Russian President Vladimir Putin feels that it's almost like a chess game. And I think there are also restraining factors that would not let him perhaps go into eastern Ukraine or indeed recreate that empire that you're talking about.
And on that note, we've got to leave it. Thank you to both of our guests, Mychailo Wynnychyj in Kiev and Lilit Gevorgyan in London. Thanks very much for your time. And of course, you can add your voice to the discussion online anytime. Just let us know your thoughts on Facebook and Twitter. That's it for now. I'm Hazem Sika. Thanks for watching. See you again.